Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us here at the American Philosophical Society. The program is going to be a little different tonight. As you see, we have some additional cameras here. We always have 6 high-def cameras streaming, and welcome to all those who are zooming in tonight to the talk. But we also have C-SPAN with us tonight. And I've been instructed to do all the housekeeping beforehand, then pause, and do a real introduction so it can be on the video. Otherwise, they cut it all down. So I just want to do a few housekeeping things. First off, make sure cell phones are off. The program tonight will be a conversation with Edward Dolnick and myself, for about 40 minutes, and then we can open it up to conversations, both online and those in person here. And I also want to flag a few events that are coming up here at the APS. First, on April the 11th is our museum exhibition opening over in Philosophical Hall. It's called Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City, and this is a remarkable display of documents. It's an exhibition that is curated by the Philosophical Society with contributions from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, from the Library Company of Philadelphia, and a number of other repositories in the area. How many total? Was it 14 I have in my head? 14 different repositories have lent to this exhibition, and it's documenting the history of the revolution here in Philadelphia. And that opening is April the 11th, our public opening. I hope you'll come. There'll be a fanfare and events. You can learn more about it on our website. Then on April the 17th, we have a book launch. The APS Press is launching its next book. It's called Why the Hindenburg Had a Smoking Lounge. Subtitle is Essays and Unintended Consequences. So that will be April the 17th. And then on May the 6th, we have our garden party. That's I Humbly Beg Your Speedy Answer with Mary Beth Norton. And what Mary Beth Norton has done is she's documented what she believes to be is the first love advice column ever to be printed in the English language. It was in the 17th century in London. I think it'll be a really fun event to hear what some of their questions they had about love and sex and marriage, all in the 17th century, and whether or not it resonates with us still today. And then in June, is it June the 5th? We have Michelle McDonald will be launching her book, Coffee Nation. So mark your calendars. Check out all these things on the website where you can register as well. All right, so now I've done the housekeeping, and now I have to say a pause. Welcome to the American Philosophical Society. My name is Patrick Spiro. I'm thrilled you all could join us tonight. Before we get to our conversation with Edward, I just want to say a few things about the Philosophical Society. I know I have a lot of friends in the audience. Many of you are familiar with what we do, but if you're not, we were founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. Our full title is the American Philosophical Society, held in Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge. And that is really what our mission is to advance knowledge. And we do that in a number of ways that you can see here on the screen. First off, we have elected members. We have the smallest, which is to say the most distinguished and elite group of members who help the society in all of its programmatic activities. These are members who are elected because of a distinguished career, advancing knowledge in whatever field they work in. As you can see on our motto, on our seal, our motto is Nullo Discrimine. We believe all knowledge can be useful, so we have members in every different facet of life that you can imagine. We also convene meetings of members that happen every April and November, and friends of the society at a certain level can attend these meetings as well. And here you'll see a range of cutting-edge research in all different fields, really showing that incredible eclecticism that defines the Philosophical Society. We also have the longest continuously operating scholarly press in North America. I've been saying that for 10 years, and no one's corrected me, and I think, Kim, you believe that too, right? Kim is our director of our press. We continue to publish books, journals. We also have a research program that provides over 300 research grants a year. About 50 of those come here to the Philosophical Society to conduct research in our library, but we send around 250 researchers into the field on all 7 continents of the world, conducting, again, cutting-edge research. And many of those that we support are early career scholars, really at the forefront of the future. And finally, we have a library and museum. That library has now amassed a collection of over 14 million pages of manuscripts, and we have an incredible museum in Philosophical Hall that has welcomed up to 200,000 visitors a year, and I hope you all will come to our next exhibition Philadelphia, the revolutionary city. But without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce my conversant tonight, Edward Dolnick. Edward is the former chief science writer at the Boston Globe. He has written for The Atlantic, the New York Times Magazine, and many other publications. He's also the author of numerous books. I have a long list here. Madness on the Couch, a critical look at Freud's legacy. The Rescue Artist, a true crime account of the theft of the Scream. And I could go on, but we are here tonight to hear about dinosaurs at the dinner party. So if we could have a conversation about that for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So thank you for joining us, Edward.
Oh, terrific. It's a treat for me.
Yeah, well, it was a treat for me to read this book, and I can't tell you how much of this book resonated with the Philosophical Society's history and what we do. First off, I was really pleased to see at least 3 citations of APS Press works in your bibliography. And then in terms of our own history, we funded what was the first successful excavation of a mastodon by Charles Wilson Peale in 1801. And then in Philosophical Hall, which was Peale's museum, was the first time a prehistoric mammal was mounted, I believe, in the United States. So that happened here at the APS. And then we have an incredible rich collection documenting kind of the history of paleontology here, beginning with Jefferson, but going all the way up into the 20th century. So this book really resonated with so much the Society has done and continues to do. So I want to begin with reading your book. What I never fully grasped was how dislocating the discovery, if you will, of dinosaurs were to 19th century society. I mean, it upset fundamental questions and ideas about time, about the Earth's history, about humanity and its place in general. I mean, the dinosaurs were one of the great disruptors of the 19th century. So I don't know if you could take us back to the world before dinosaurs created all these challenges for thinkers. How did people imagine the natural world before dinosaurs?
Well, it's a terrific question, and it was a big surprise to me. And what started me on this book is that the discovery of dinosaurs came late. It was pretty much 1800, and what you see is the smartest people in the world finding these enormous bones and being bewildered by what they were. So what was so intriguing to me is you had these brilliant people beating their heads against the wall, unable to come up with an answer that any 6-year-old today would say, wait a minute, that's not so hard. I'll tell you all about it. So that was the question. How could it be that it took so long and was so puzzling? And the reason it's called Dinosaurs at the Dinner Party, well, there are a couple of reasons. One was that it's meant to convey that this book this won't be homework. It will be fun to read. But part of the dinner party notion is that the natural world in 1800, which is about when dinosaurs first turn up, was a cozy place. Deers bounded, birds flitted through the sky. Everything was lovely. The world, people thought, was a kind of diorama. God had designed it. He had worked with meticulous care. He had put bushes here, and he'd chosen just which fish would be best in streams and flowers, and he'd painted every stripe on every zebra. Everything was just so. It was lovely. It was perfect. And then, in the course of the Industrial Revolution, lots of digging begins, digging railroads, digging canals. And in the course of that digging, people come across these enormous bones, much bigger than anything they had ever seen. And they couldn't think what in the world this could possibly be. Could they be elephants? No, they were too big for elephants. Giants, maybe? Because it says in the Bible there were giants in the earth in those days. But maybe that was a little far-fetched, so maybe that was wrong. But whatever these dinosaurs were, or I shouldn't have said dinosaurs, whatever these bones were, whatever creatures they belonged to, plainly weren't around anymore. And so once upon a time, there had been something very big and presumably very scary. And now it was gone. What happened to them? And so the natural world in the mind of these first discoverers of these bones changed from this lovely, cozy place where all was well and all was sunshine and bird song to a kind of spooky place. So it's these dinosaurs are an interruption of this cozy dinner party. It's as if you're at your party in a lovely country house, and all of a sudden there comes a scratching at the window. And you think, what was that? So it was so upsetting, this discovery. First of all, because no one had ever imagined that there had been such things. The notion of almost everyone was that the natural world had always looked the way it did today. The creatures in the world were the ones you know from Noah's Ark. There were lions and tigers and bears. Here was something plainly different than that. And worse than that, whatever creatures these bones belonged to, didn't seem to be around anymore. And if that was so, they had vanished. And extinction was an idea that had almost not occurred to anyone else either. Because if God had designed the world and God was a perfect creator, he wouldn't make mistakes. He doesn't try something out and think, oh, that's not good, and crumple it up and throw that in the wastebasket. He has created perfect creatures for each niche. But these were no longer around. So had God tired of them? And if he tired of them, this was the scariest thought of all. Could it be that we, who were the point of creation, could he someday tire of us? And that was a brand new question, and it was a spooky question because it was hard to deny the evidence. These bones, these ribs were big. They were hard to talk away. Something had been there, and now it wasn't. And that was a frightening thought.
Well, actually, in your answer, a few things that really struck me in this book were, these bones were before the 19th century. The bones were being discovered, and they're trying to be interpreted. And what I didn't realize was that things like the Cyclops, which you mentioned, may have some. The idea of the Cyclops may have some roots in discovering bones. The Griffin, which really surprised me, may have to do with discovering fossilized bones. Do you want to share with people that story?
These were surprises to me, too. These bones, as I say, turned up in great profusion starting in the early 1800s, not because people were more curious, but because there was more digging then for things like railroads and roadways. But over the centuries, in the course of making a road or farming a field, people had come across giant bones, but they always incorporated them into whatever the local mythology was. So in China, these were signs that there were dragons once upon a time. In the New World, the Aztecs had found enormous bones, but their story was that these had belonged to formidable people that their ancestors had conquered, and so you could see what a mighty race we are. Look at what our forebears, look at who they conquered. But this business of Cyclops and Griffins in Greece. There were in ancient Greece. There was some kind, evidently, of prehistoric elephants, smaller than present-day elephants, that had lived there. And if you have ever seen the skull of an elephant, they have a curious look. Our skulls have the two big eyes in the front and the hole for the nose, but the skull of an elephant is actually a more peculiar thing. The eyes, you'd have to know a little bit to find them. They're around the side, toward the back. And what you see if you look at an elephant skull is a giant hole, front and center, which is where the trunk attaches. And so there's a brilliant a woman who's both a classic scholar and a paleontologist at Stanford, who has studied these ancient skulls. And what she has found is that the places in Greece where these skulls were found, the places that had the most detailed records of cyclopses and stories about them were also the places where these peculiar skulls with the giant missing hole had turned up in the first place. Nobody knows which came first. Do you have the mythology and then you happen on one of these skulls and you say, "See, I was right all along," Or do you find this strange skull with the single hole in the center, and from there, someone clever invents the myth? No one knows. And the story of griffins, who are these mythical beasts, half lion, half eagle, seem to be also an early attempt to make sense of some strange hybrid skeletons. So what happened in the 1800s, it wasn't that this was the first time giant bones were found. It was that this was the first time giant bones were found in an era when people said, we have to come up with something more persuasive than dragons or formidable giants in the past. What's really going on here? And so it was as recent as that. These early Victorian scientists tried to say, let's do better than myths. Let's see if we can figure out where these bones came from.
Yeah, and a lot of these bones come from the cliffs in England. England itself plays a really large role. I don't know if you could share with us how bones, fossils are actually created. They're actually not bones. I don't know, you detail the process here. I don't know if you can share with us how fossils are actually created.
Well, this was a great mystery at the time. No one was quite sure what fossils were. They looked a lot like relics of the natural world. They looked like seashells or ferns or something like that. But on the other hand, seashells and ferns weren't made of rock, so it was hard to sort out how that could be. And if you think about it, if you had as your career ambition to become a fossil, it's actually a terribly hard job. Much easier to become an actor or a classical musician or something. You have to die in the right place, first of all, so that you will sink slowly to the floor of an ocean is most likely, rather than on land where storms and wind and all kinds of critters will tear into your carcass. So nearly all the fossils found early on were from sea creatures, because life, or death, more to the point, was gentler than it was on land. And the great controversy early on, around 1600, say, was what these fossils were. They looked like relics of animals or plants, as I say. But there was one school of thought that God had made them to test your faith, and so they weren't. It wasn't that this was a relic of a fern. It was a demonstration of how unlimited God's artistry was. He could do this, or maybe the devil had done it. He had tried to befuddle you with these strange things that looked alive, but were in a place that it didn't make sense for living things to be, because fossils would often turn up in a quarry, say hundreds of feet underground, where miners were digging, say, slate for the roof of a building, and in the course of that, they would find something that looked like a fern, say, and it was plain that the fern hadn't grown hundreds of feet deep. It wasn't that it had burrowed its way in like a hedgehog or something, and so it was a great mystery and a great debate for a long while where these fossils came from, and sometimes they were. The emblem of the mystery was that you would occasionally see seashells on top of a mountain, and so seashells didn't belong there. The first who figured out how they had got there was Robert Hooke, who was a brilliant scientist, a contemporary, an rival of Isaac Newton. It wasn't good to be a rival of Newton. He was a nasty fellow, but Hooke explained it. He said, well, if the seashells are on a mountain where they don't belong, maybe but seashells do belong in the sea, maybe somehow mountains and sea over the course of eons had changed places, and this is demonstration of that. And it turned out that he was right about that. He was ahead of everybody else by several centuries. The much more common attitude was Voltaire, who was a great admirer of science and a brilliant fellow, but he comes along much later than Hooke, and he says, well, you're giving us all these strange notions about mountains and ocean changing places like kids on a seesaw. That doesn't make much sense," he says. Wouldn't it be more likely that some picnicker happened to have left an oyster shell behind after? And so that was considered a conclusive dismissal of these highfalutin theories that there had been some scientific explanation. It took a long while. By 1800, by the time we get to that fossil debate, though, had been pretty well settled. People finally believed that they were relics of living creatures, but it took centuries for that view to win out.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about some of the people that helped that new view of the world and the past, help make that other people see this. One is Mary Anning. Who was she and what did she do?
Well, Mary Anning is one of the heroes of the story. I came to quite love Mary Anning. She was a woman who was born in 1799, I think, on the southern coast of England. She lived in Lyme Regis, the town that, if you ever saw The French Lieutenant's Woman years ago, it's the lovely romantic town there. In her day, it wasn't a lovely romantic town. No one went on seaside vacations in the old days because the seashore was the home, the haunt of pirates and fishermen and smugglers. It was no place for respectable people. But then around 1800, Napoleon is now at loose in Europe. Suddenly, if you're English and you have lots of money and it's time for a holiday, Europe doesn't seem as appealing as it once did. And at this point, there becomes a vogue for staying closer to home, and people explore some of these seaside towns. And a doctor who was a big name at the time says that actually there's all kind of health benefits. Instead of going to spas like Bath, you can go to these seaside resorts, and rather than drink the healing waters at Bath, you should actually try drinking some of the salt water, which was a difficult recipe, but it did have a vogue. At any rate, these towns suddenly become in, and Mary Anning, who is a member of a poor, nearly destitute family, lives in one of these towns that suddenly has all sorts of visitors coming in. And she and her father are able to eke out a living by selling tourists these strange things that they've found after storms, mostly in the cliffs that you see on the edge of town. Mostly little things, akin to nautilus shells, that sort of thing. People didn't know what they were really, but some people would want them for a knickknack for their bookshelves or that kind of thing. But Mary had an uncanny eye for spotting after a storm, say, in an eroded cliff, just a little nubbin of something or other strange, and she would dig away and tease it out. It took ages. But she became one of the first to find prehistoric creatures from hundreds of millions of years ago. No one knew what these things were. She unearthed one that was her first great find, was about the size of a dolphin. She had an older brother. When the brother was coming home one day when he was 12, he brought home the skull. He'd found this strange skull, and she looks at it, and the two of them go back to the spot on the beach where he'd found that skull, and they dig around for more, and they can't find any more. But she persists, and over the course of 2 or 3 years, she finally finds the rest of the body. It wasn't far from the skull, but it was several feet away and several feet down in the ground as well. But she finds it, and then she makes other finds, these are unprecedented. People have no notion what they are. They're not much inclined. Mary had 3 strikes against her in this era. She was poor, she was uneducated, and she was female. That made it really hard to get a hearing. So what she would do, she had begun by selling knickknacks, the little shells she found. But now that she had made this amazing find, people would actually come to see them, and now some collectors would buy them, and they would pay a good deal. So Mary, whose family was on the equivalent of welfare, all of a sudden they would sell one of her finds, and for 6 months or so, the family would have enough food. That dolphin skeleton, say, that she had found, would a collector would buy it for a considerable sum, and eventually donate it to a museum, which would put his name on it. Never Mary Anning's. It would say a generous bequest of so and so. She made several of the greatest fossil finds of them all, so much so that despite these strikes against her, the lack of education and so on, scientists soon caught on that if you wanted to see these things, what you had to do is make an excursion to Lyme Regis and ask Mary Anning if she would be willing to take you by the hand and show you around. And so now she becomes quite a well-regarded figure, still not so well-regarded that anybody puts her name to it. And she's constantly in money trouble, often finding things, selling them, but the money soon runs out. Today, if you go to the Natural History Museum in London, there on the top floor there's a room for donors, in where the board of the museum meets for special occasions. It's the Mary Anning room. She would never have been allowed in the Mary Anning room, but there's a portrait of her. There's a copy of a letter she wrote to a friend of hers that says, "I found something remarkable. No one has ever seen anything like it." The letter was just put up for auction a few years ago. The letter, not the skeleton she was describing, went for £100,000. But Mary never saw anything like that. But she was formidable, and she kept a diary. She wrote in it that these men of science, she said, have sucked me dry and never given me any credit. So I liked her. She was not only capable, but this marvelously feisty thing. But as I say, passed over. But one of the great heroes of the fossil story. She had a knack that no one ever matched for knowing where to look and what to find.
If I remember right, the Royal Society acknowledged her as one of the greatest scientists of the modern era, or something along those lines.
Yeah. They. She has come into her own lately. The Bank of England decided that they were going to put a scientist on. I think it maybe was the £50 note. I can't remember which. They started with a list of 1,000 names, and Mary made it down to the final 12. In the end, they chose Alan Turing himself, which not a bad choice, but maybe appropriate that Mary, who all her life was scrounging for money, would in the end be done in by the bank. But people had thought, and the museum, the Natural History Museum in London, in fact, has on a couple of their walls a quote that they attribute to Mary Anning. You know, she sells seashells by the seashore. Well, supposedly that was Mary Anning who. It wasn't true. In fact, it turned out that decades after her death, someone made up that tongue twister as an exercise for elocution students, but it somehow was attributed to her, and now places as august as the Natural History Museum have write it in elegant script on the walls. She sells Mary Anning. She did sell seashells by the seashore, but she wasn't
the subject of it. But one of the fun facts that is true has to do with the Shell Transport Company.
Yeah, one of the things that's peculiar about this era, the book is about from 1800 to 1850 or so. Darwin comes along. Origin of Species is 1859. So this is just before Darwin, and none of these people know, as they talk about their diorama that God built and God did everything perfectly, none of them know that working away in quiet, a country gentleman is assembling a bomb that's going to blow all their tidy theories sky high. They don't know that yet. So tell me why I was saying that.
Well, I would say well, it was a minor tangent that I wanted. The Shell transport company is actually the Shell Oil company, right?
So that's why I was telling you that, because this whole Victorian era was mad about everything, anything. From the natural world, not only bones, but beetle collecting was a national sport because they're so colorful. There's so many of them. Butterflies, seaweed was a great thing. You would go to the seashore, you would collect seaweed, you would press it in an album, and as a gift to a friend or as a fundraiser, where we would sell a pie or something to raise money for the local elementary school. In that era, someone would have contributed a album full of seaweed. Queen Victoria had a seaweed album. So anything that lived or grew or ran or slithered was tremendously exciting. And one of the things that people collected were seashells because they were pretty, and if you would go to the beach, you might find them. And by way of showing just how crazed this society was for any kind of natural history knickknack, there was a couple in the East End of London, which was the slums in those days, who would work and collect seashells of various sorts and put them up for sale, and people would buy those and they would put them on the mantelpiece at home or something. And then this couple, the seashell sellers, would get more ambitious, and they would take lots of shells and they would glue them on a little music box or a jewelry box or something like that, and people would buy that. And then you would buy, you could choose different arrangements of shells. You could have them around a mirror, or this became tremendously popular. People really snatched up these shell souvenirs, and the couple, this East End couple who had been selling them, did better and better. They expanded more and more. Now they wanted, they would hang out at the docks, and when sailors came back from far-fetched places, if they had happened to buy or see a shell in someplace exotic, like the Philippines, a kind that you didn't see in England, our seashell buyers would buy those and mark them up and put those for sale. Soon they became the Shell Transport Company was their name, because these shells came from all over. Finally, they sold out, but shells were still the big part of their business, although they had branched out so much that the company still exists today, but now it's Shell Oil. that was the founding of the fortune, was these eager Victorians buying seashells for their mirrors.
Yeah, that was just an unbelievable fun fact when I was reading it. So getting back to the story of the dinosaurs, they're working within a paradigm that thinks that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. They're focused on the idea of evolution. Even extinction doesn't exist. So can you talk about some of the theories people had about what these bones meant? And in particular, could you talk about the guy over your shoulder, Thomas Jefferson, and the role he plays in this story?
So Thomas Jefferson does come into our story. It was, if you had been here 127 years ago, I think, you would have had a much more distinguished speaker than either of us. Here's Thomas Jefferson talking about a marvelous thing. He was tremendously interested, in everything under the sun, but in fossils and prehistoric creatures of all sort. And there was a notion at this time, America, when it comes to science, is still kind of a backwater place. All the action is in Europe in this era, around 1800. And in particular, the most eminent naturalist of the day, who's a Frenchman who was kind of a walking sneer of contempt for all that was not him and was not French, had a theory that America was kind of a cold and dreary place, and therefore all its natural creations were themselves small and stunted. So in America, they wrote dogs didn't have the energy to bark, and the old world had elephants, but the most imposing creature that the New World could boast was a mule. That was how terrible life was in this cold, wet, clammy climate. So Jefferson was furious about this. This was a slander on all things American and imposing. So not only was he interested in fossils and bones just because he was interested in science, but it turned out that right in his era, people had found what today we know are mammoths and mastodons, these enormous things, far bigger than elephants. So he could now say to the Europeans, you say we're so puny. What do you have to match this? And in fact, Jefferson, he wrote in a letter to a friend, he had the good taste not to publish it, but he said, this theory about how we're so puny, might I point out that I'm 6'2", whereas Count Buffon, my great critic, is a little runt of 5'5", but that's neither here nor there. At any rate, he was thrilled that America had been home to the mastodon, and he said in this lecture in 1797, not only do we have mastodons, these marvelous creatures, but we have a lion that makes the African lion look like a tabby cat. And he said, I've seen teeth of these things. And whereas the teeth of an African lion are about yay big, the teeth of the American lion are like this. And that was what he unveiled at his lecture here, that America had been home to this marvelous and imposing lion. He gave that talk, and a few days later he was browsing in a bookstore not far from here, and there he reads a scientific article that somebody in South America has found a giant sloth, and it has the strangest bones. It has teeth or claws that are this long, and if you didn't know better, you might mistakenly think that you had seen some kind of a lion. So now Jefferson is not thrilled with this, and his manuscript is already out of his hands, and he writes to the publisher, let's change things. Where I said American lion, let's say creature of the clawed kind. And so it turns out that America's lions were not this enormous mega creature that Jefferson had hoped for. What he had found bones from was a giant ground sloth, a prehistoric vegetarian, not nearly as good to fling in the face of Europeans as this lion. But Jefferson and Franklin and George Washington, they were all thrilled with fossils, thrilled and fascinated. For Jefferson in particular, so when Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark west, part of their instructions, and I got to see the real life letter thanks to Michelle's labors today. Part of Jefferson's instructions to Lewis and Clark is, I want you to write down the name of every river you see and every flower and every plant, and if you see any lions or any mastodons, take special note. His notion, this is a big country. These are big animals, but there's no telling what might be hiding out there. And in particular, he didn't believe in extinction because although he wasn't a fundamentalist by any means, he didn't believe that the Bible was literally true. He did believe that creation was orderly and tidy, and so for a species which had once lived to have vanished suddenly would be this kind of unsightly intellectual defect. It would be kind of like a gap in a smile. It would ruin the entire intellectual edifice. So extinction could not be. So these fossils, these bones, that he had found, or that people had found and shown to him, it couldn't be that the creatures that they belonged to had vanished. They must be lurking somewheres, and maybe the West, which was big and unexplored, was the somewheres.
That's great, and that actually brings me to what you refer to as the asteroid, which is George Cuvier and his theories that really upset, in many ways, Jefferson's idea of extinction, the idea of what dinosaurs could be. Do you want to share, and I love the analogy use of an asteroid, which we know is what destroyed the dinosaurs most likely. What is the asteroid that Cuvier lands, if you will, in the scientific community?
So George Cuvier is a Frenchman, the great eminence of this era. Cuvier was so impressive a figure at identifying fossils, at piecing them together, at seeing from a tiny bit of evidence what the whole picture was, that in one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, somebody says, my God, Sherlock Holmes is as brilliant as Cuvier. And this was the highest praise you can imagine. And what Cuvier did, in what made such trouble for Jefferson and the others who had argued that extinction was impossible, was he looked at these mammoths and these mastodons, these great bones in their teeth, and he said, the closest relatives they have today are elephants, but these weren't elephants. And he listed the specific ways you could tell which was an elephant bone and which was one of these mammoth or mastodon bones. These mastodon relics, Cuvier said, improved, were different than anything seen today. There are creatures that are akin to them, but they weren't responsible for these bones that we found. Whoever these bones belong to is no longer here. And Cuvier was so eminent, and he made the argument with such specificity that no one could rebut it. That was the end of the argument that extinction is impossible. So that made what Cuvier did is establish that the world, contrary to what everyone thought, the world had not always looked the way it does to us. It wasn't that the only animals there had ever been were the ones we know, lions and tigers. Once upon a time, there had been these strange things, these massive elephants. It seemed as if there had once been lizards bigger than an elephant, a completely strange and bygone world. And this is an utterly new notion. Natural history was a phrase, it was an ancient phrase, but there had never been any history in natural history. The notion had always been that the world wasn't very young, wasn't very old, as you say, and always looked the way it does now. Now all of a sudden came this utterly contrary notion. The world had looked much different, and in fact there had been a previous world, or maybe a sequence of previous worlds, one on top of the other, and we were only the latest. It wasn't that we were the only one in the whole point of creation. There had been other creations, it seemed, and they were now gone.
Yeah, and then just two more questions before we open it up to the audience. Your book really ends on this kind of battle between what I would say, describe maybe as paradigms. There's Owen in England, Robert Owen, I believe, and then also coming out of England is Charles Darwin, and they offer two very different arguments. Do you want to talk about, and Darwin ultimately wins out, but what was their debate?
So in the first half of the 1800s, the most famous scientist in England was a fellow named Richard Owen, a brilliant, cantankerous, impossible fellow. He accumulated enemies by the score. He was brilliant, but insufferable, terribly vain, terribly argumentative, always eager to pick a fight. Tall, skinny. He looked like Ichabod Crane. Someone said actually that Unfortunately, as he grew older, he grew to look more and more like the fossils that he'd studied. He had these deep sunken eyes and an immense high forehead and skinny as a stick and very tall.
And if you buy your book afterwards, which everyone should, there are photographs in there to document that.
But what Richard Owen believed, it was actually hard to sort out exactly what he believed. One historian said that his prose was difficult at best and incomprehensible at worst. So it takes some deciphering. But what he thought was that he believed in a kind of evolution, but it wasn't Darwinian evolution with survival of the fittest and nature red in tooth and claw. It was a kind of unrolling and unfolding, which is the way we still use the word evolution in ordinary speech. We say, my father was insufferable, is such a bigot, but he's evolved over the years. And that's how Richard Owen thought of the natural world. Once upon a time, there had been slugs and snails and worms, and then along had come slightly more impressive creatures, mice and hamsters, and then had come along horses and deer, and now with the flourish of trumpets at the end, had come us. And Darwin. So Richard Owen says this all through the middle decades of the 1800s. Darwin, Origin of Species, is 1859. Darwin's theory is completely different. Instead of this tidy unfolding, life is a game of musical chairs. There aren't enough chairs to go around. Ever so slightly sharper elbows, ever so slightly quicker reflexes might get you a seat in one of those chairs. And if you do, and if it so happens that you're able to pass along those sharp elbows or those quick reflexes, maybe the world will change in that way, and soon we'll have a lot of quick, sharp-witted creatures. But it could easily well go a different way. It isn't an orderly unfolding, like Richard Owen says. Owen hates that. Owen hates Darwin. Darwin, who is a lovely, gentle, mild man, one of the heroes of history that the more you look, the more his heroism still holds up. You don't have to say, I wish he hadn't said that. He was an admirable character. But Darwin writes to a friend, I have vowed never to hate anyone, but Richard Owen, I'd make an exception. Owen, as I say, was a giant, towering figure in his day, and his legacy, his ideas have nearly been forgotten. But his legacy is the Natural History Museum in London, a great cathedral if you've ever been. It's the one that has the Mary Anning rooms, a huge temple to science, stained glass windows, every kind of creature in the world, a beautiful monument to science and to the intellectual life. It was Owen's idea. Owen raised the money for it. Owen put a huge statue of himself front and center. Nowadays, if you go to that museum, you have to ask, and it takes a long time to find where the statue of Richard Owen is. It's tucked away in a custodian's closet somewhere. But front and center in white marble is Charles Darwin presiding in glory, Owen's great enemy, and people come up and they take their picture with Darwin, who's the hero of the day, and no one knows Owen. Darwin got it right, Owen got it wrong on a very important question. How does the natural world come to look the way it does? Today we all know Darwin, and hardly anyone knows Owen.
Yeah, and I have to say that this book was an incredible romp through time and space with these amazing characters that you really bring to life, and I think you've done that for us tonight. My big takeaway with this book was the limits that strongly held beliefs can put on scientific imagination. The first part of this book is how people are struggling to fit dinosaurs into the paradigm or into narrative of the world that they have accepted. And the answer is actually outside of that. And it took a long time for people to come to terms with that. What I want to ask you for my last question is, when you think you've been a science writer studying science for decades, when you look at the world today, are there areas where you think our strongly held beliefs are limiting our imagination and our creativity, and where might those be?
It's such a good, hard question. Every generation takes for granted, it's hard not to take for granted, that there's a kind of escalator of progress that we know a lot today, and in the past we didn't know so much. But we always think that escalator of progress stops on our floor. Isn't it good fortune that we happen to be alive in the era when we've figured out everything? So presumably we haven't. But what's odd, and what means that I can't really answer your question properly, is that we all live inside an intellectual bubble where certain questions make sense and certain ones don't occur to us. My strong belief is that 6-year-olds of the future will look back on us and say, how could they have been so silly? How could it have taken them so long to catch on? But I don't know what those 6-year-olds, those future 6-year-olds, will be pointing at.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Edward.
Thanks.
I think we have time for a few questions, if there are any from the crowd. Yes. Oh, hold on. We've got people online in C-SPAN. Yeah.
Thanks for that really interesting debate. I wondered whether you use any instances in your book when dinosaurs literally were at the dinner table, or I'm thinking of the events at Crystal Palace in the 1850s. The dinner table was literally inside the dinosaur.
That's a wonderful story, and
It's in the book.
That's how the book winds up. We're at a dinner, exactly as you say, inside a 30-foot long replica of a dinosaur. This is just before Darwin, where Richard Owen and his friends think, this was a big mystery. It took a long time to figure out what these bones were. We figured it out. Let's celebrate ourselves. It's New Year's Eve, 1853. They have this long, rollicking banquet inside this model of a dinosaur. It's so tall that the waiters have to climb a staircase to bring course after course to these diners who are celebrating around the table. Richard Owen is at the head of the dinosaur and at the head of the table, and the songs and the drinking and the toasting goes on so long into the night. It's New Year's Eve, but the party starts at about 4 in the afternoon. At midnight, they're still at it, and they kind of toddle home, considerably the worse for wear, but very pleased with themselves. They've figured out this evolution business. They know all about dinosaurs. Very soon after, Mr. Darwin will come along and explode that complacency.
I believe also at the APS they may have had a dinner party in the Mastodon when Humboldt visited the Philosophical Society.
Oh, is that so?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know. Oh, how wonderful. Yes.
Great. Yes, sir.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out. Question for you. Did you come across any a sacred truth maybe you held since childhood and in your research and say, wow, I'm surprised that that's not the way it went, or did anything surprise you in your findings?
Well, the big surprise, as I say, was that this was a new story. I had been like every other 6-year-old. I had little plastic dinosaurs, and I probably had dinosaur pajamas, although I can't remember. I know I liked to draw them. And it only recently dawned on me that at some point, at most points in history, no one would have known what I was up to with those little creatures in those strange drawings. That you always read how Leonardo da Vinci had thought of everything, and Galileo and Ben Franklin. And it's true, they had thought of nearly everything. But they hadn't thought of this. They hadn't thought of a bygone world with these strange slithering creatures. I had taken for granted that what I knew, everybody had always known. I should have known that was wrong, but it took me a long time to learn it.
Yes, sir.
The talk was very interesting, thank you. I know that you're not an ethicist or a futurist necessarily, but the concept of they started, it took really a very short time, 60 some odd years to go from the dinosaur tracks in New England to Charles Darwin. As a function of the construct that they existed in, you can't really call them science deniers, but as a metaphor for some attitudes that exist in the world today, do you ever see a time when that concept of science denial might go by the wayside?
Well, let's hope. What's strange about this story is that there have been eras when science and religion did clash. Galileo versus the church is a correct story. The way it's told is roughly right. What was surprising about this is that the scientists and the religious people were not at odds. They were the same people quite often. A lot of the scientists that we talk about were not only devout, but were clergymen. And the reason they could get away with that is because their beliefs didn't clash. Their notion that the world was perfect and orderly, and look at the eagle's eyesight and look at the cheetah's speed, all fit with what a marvelous creator we have. And so studying the natural world was a way of paying homage to religion. And so part of the reason that Darwin was such a shock was it wasn't simply that he came along with a different scientific theory. He came along with a theory that dislodged us. It said, you who've made your living by saying you're so special, maybe you're not so special. And that was really, really a hard lesson. And so when you say, will we do better? Well, you'd certainly like to hope so. But you can see from the way that Darwin, it's not utterly settled today. Because I think this notion that we're not the point of it all is a hard lesson for us. It's psychologically hard, it's intellectually hard. So if we'll be able to learn our lesson, to say let's take a longer view, well, I hope we will, but it's a hard question. Yes.
If I could follow up on that while this is getting down there. If you want to share, what also surprised me in this book is how late the word dinosaur itself was coined.
It did come very late. It was 1843. It was, in fact, our man Richard Owen, this malevolent but brilliant fellow, who saw it. And what he said was that I found a collection of bones here and a collection here and a collection here, and they don't seem to have anything in common, but actually they have something terribly important in common. And what they have in common was that there was a category of prehistoric creature that no one has ever called attention to, no one has ever recognized, and they deserve a special name, special recognition. He was right about that. As difficult a character as he was also a brilliant fellow, and he made that nervy call that based on only 3 cases, I see a whole new category in the world. He made that call and he got it right.
Right. Last question.
Darwin had to tiptoe around a bit because his wife, of course, was highly religious and was quite upset by some of what he was suggesting. So the clash between religion and science in that context was actually within Darwin's own family. But I've just been reading a book that tells us that Darwin's great-grandfather actually discovered dinosaur bones in England but had no idea what they were. And his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, also a naturalist, was actually a member of the American Philosophical Society here in Philadelphia. So my question is, were you able to connect his grandfather's work, Erasmus, because obviously Erasmus was admitted because of his scientific prowess, but were you able to connect his grandfather's work with the work of the society here in Philadelphia at all?
I wish I had. I didn't. My story was mostly a story set in England because that's where most of these early discoveries were. The story you tell about Darwin and his wife, though, is this marvelous, poignant story. Darwin, over the course of 20 or 30 years, is working on the origin of species, and now he's got to the point where he's pretty sure he's got it right, and he writes to a friend of his. He says he's going to unveil his theory at some point, and he writes, "It is like confessing a murder." He knows that the world is going to come down on his head, and he writes in a letter. You can tell me, I believe found after his death that his wife had pleaded with him, if what you've been working away on all these years, if it looks as if it's going to undermine religion, please don't go there. It would destroy me. They had lost a child, the Darwins had, and Darwin's wife knew that there would someday reconcile in the afterlife, and now Darwin was he shooting that down? And Darwin quotes this letter from his wife when she'd asked him to soft pedal it, and he writes in the margin, he says, "I have often cried over this." So it is a terribly personal debate for him. He too is fighting the hold of religion on our psyches, on our intuition, with this notion that the evidence just seems different than that.
Great point to end on. So thank you again, Edward.